Hi, and welcome back to Friendly Tech Chats. We really loved the response to our first few episodes, so now we're back with a new episode on contract testing. So we'll talk about our experience with it and mostly our opinions with it, because that's what this is all about.
Yes, and let's start with a definition or what we understand about contract-based testing when we talk about this. So I usually mean that it's a testing which is based around an artifact, a contract, which is this artifact is assessed against consumer and producer side in some kind of communication. And those assessments, tests, they happen independently. So you don't need to have both consumer and producer running together. They're independently executed. And my assumption that by default they are not supposed to be executed within a live or shadow environment. So this is in isolation. This is not the contract-based testing is not the system end-to-end test.
Yeah, but because it is intended to kind of at least replace some of the responsibilities of system end-to-end tests, right?
Yes, and its focus is on the contract, not on the functionality itself.
Yeah,
is it correct? Does it fit your understanding of the contract-based testing?
Yeah, definitely. Especially that you can test communication between different systems in isolation in each system separately, in each build pipeline of these systems separately. I think that's where the power of this this way of testing comes from, that you can test the way they communicate each other by having this shared artifact, but you don't have a dependency on actual each other's pipelines or running systems or deployment strategies. So that's what I really like conceptually about contract testing. But you had some doubts about the concept. So.
When I heard about contract testing, it sounds very plausible. Yes, this is a piece that we're missing, and we don't want to do tests on the integrated environments because they're expensive, they are flaky. It's always we don't want to do that much. So that's a nice solution. You're breaking out those things and move those tests into isolation, both separately, consumer and producer. Great. But then, okay, you're adding extra dependency on this artifact, probably worth it. But then I started to wonder how much I will get in return. How often these contracts are getting broken? When you have already established contract, in my experience at least, to maintain backwards compatibility, it's not a very difficult task. So that's why I was not really myself rushing in that area. I wanted to see how industry will pick up experience, the tooling will mature around it, and so on.
So you do see that the end-to-end integration tests are really expensive, but you're saying just not having these tests is a better situation than having contract tests instead of them?
No, I just did not see much problem in particularly the area where the contract tests are focusing on.
So what is that area then exactly?
The contract between two services, consumer and producer. I can do much more simpler tests than the contract-based testing. I can just grab the output of a service or fake it if the producer is not present yet. Put it in my unit test with wiremog, and then I have my test that I can read what is returned from the server. I don't need this extra stub setup. I don't need the explicit contract. I don't need the pipelines that communicate to this contract. And I'm not saying that it's better what I'm doing, but basically I can test it good enough for me. And the same I can do on the producer side. It's very easy. I just say this will be the request that you will be getting. So it's very low tech. It's not very reliable way, but it's good enough. And on the other hand, I did not see in my experience. That's why I'm curious. I didn't see that many problem with the contract suddenly getting broken. At least not in the way that contract-based, I believe, are focusing on. It's not like suddenly the field that was required disappears in the output.
So what this sounds like to me is what you're describing is conceptually the same as a contract test, that you just take the output of a service and put that in your wiremark directly. I think quite a few of these frameworks actually use wiremark under the hood. But to me, I think this might be one of those cases where just doing it right is also good enough.
Yes, maybe.
But you can use the process to enable people who would not naturally do this right to do it better. So there's always, I always have this idea that by definition 95% of the software engineers are not the top 5% of software engineers. So
neither am I. So that's perfectly fine. Yes.
No. Yeah. Exactly. So you need to design systems for to work with fallible humans, and working with implicit contracts, which I think your solution is. I think that is. That can work if everyone does it right. But perhaps at scale it might be valuable to have a way of working, perhaps a pack broker that enforces this communication.
Maybe, but that's another problem, that at scale at bol.com I didn't see this problem. Maybe it's in my area because I was usually at the back office. But I didn't see a problem. Mm-hmm. So even if you don't do any contract testing, okay, I would do a little bit this implicit one, but even if you don't do anything, you just deploy once to environment, you check that things are working, you don't have to check it every time because contracts are not changing by the whim. We had sometimes, very rarely in my experience, some backwards incompatible changes in API, but teams and people around them are very quickly learning them, and that becomes just ingrained in the way of working. And we are not the top 5%. The people me and many at bol.com, not because they were bad, but our focus not only that much on the technical side of the things. So I think that means that you don't need to be, to me, prove this. You don't need to be the top of the notch to be able to produce good enough APIs. Maybe it's a little bit different on the APIs that are talking to the outside world. Maybe there you might want to have extra steps, I don't know. But within the microservice, I didn't see much appeal. I didn't see many problems that if we had contract-based testing, we hadn't had this problem. At least in my areas. I know that some people, there were more painful other areas, especially the services that are aggregating the data. But that's another story, another part of this story. But what do you think about this, Bart, so far? And I cannot hear you.
Yeah, that's because I wasn't saying anything. I was thinking about it because to me it is very apparent that keeping up an expensive copy of production to do end-to-end tests does not provide relevant protection against bugs, because it will never be production. And I think that it's admirable to move away from dependency on such duplicated environments. However, there are a lot of these tests that do depend on these integration environments, test environments, acceptance environments, and so clearly there has historically been value in these end-to-end tests. Otherwise, the environments wouldn't be there. And
no, I would argue on that, but please continue.
So even even if there is no value, but there's just there, and there's people dependent on the fact that they're there, and they don't want to see that gone. I think the case is easier to make to switch from such an environment to a contract-based approach than it is to switch to not doing those kinds of tests at all. Does that make any sense?
Well, you can do testing on production. That's where I would usually check the contracts and get my input for my implicit contract test.
Yeah,
but
I think that's a harder sell.
Yeah, that can be a harder sell. But if you are moving into continuous delivery, that will be probably that might be a natural way of doing things. We were talking so far is that for people like me who are doing even trunk-based development, continuous delivery, we might not see much value in this. Why would I need to have an extra artifact, an extra step, an extra build step somewhere, and dependency between the build steps of the pipelines of different services and run by different teams, extra moving part. But we are saying that if we are in a less favorable situation, when our pipelines are not as fast, we don't know our collaborations that well, we're not as good at tracking our backwards incompatible changes, then the contract-based testing could potentially give us a value.
I think the end goal is to have teams communicate properly with each other.
That's a very good point. I would like to get back to what I heard from people. And one of the things that I heard from some of my friends is actually that it didn't really matter the technical part of them. They use the whole project of contract-based testing to have a structured communication about the APIs. And that was it, because the other ways in that political or technical or sociological environment didn't work. So yes, that
right.
can be a value. So it's not really a technical, it's people value, communication value.
Yeah, I think that's the most important aspect. And then I do think that whether you actually have a built artifact is secondary to that value. So I think you can get a lot of the value from contract-based testing without running a pack broker.
Yes,
but I do think that there's value in the concept.
And that raises another question for me, which maybe we can start the next part with.
No, I think that's a great idea. Let's do that.